Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience. It's really great to see so many people here this evening. Sorry that a lot of you have to stand at the back. So tonight's event is the second in a series of programs that forms part of the survey of Union Gaucho Productions, currently taking place here at Artist Space Books and Talks. I hope you've had the chance to see aspects of the exhibition upstairs. And during the regular opening hours of the exhibition, you can also view the films that you've seen upstairs, downstairs here in the basement cinema, so you can select and view particular films individually. So Union Gaucho Productions was founded in the late 1990s by artists Nicholas Guagnini and Karen Schneider, and the survey provides an overview of the films and videos produced under this rubric, while also looking to extend the fluid situations and interrelated processes that UGP sought to activate in their production through the specific machine of film. The programs taking place over the course of the 2-month exhibition reflect on existing collaborations and generate new ones, and develop ideas and influences present within the works upstairs. The program tonight looks towards questions raised at the intersection of filmmaking and ethnography, particularly where the assumed objectivity of the analytic documentary form is problematized and distinctions between object and subject break down. We will be screening 2 seminal documents in relation to this discourse, The Laughing Alligator from 1979 by the Chilean video artist Juan Downey, and Les Maîtres Fous from 1955 by filmmaker and anthropologist Jean Rouch. These 2 works have provided important keystones in the writing and thinking of anthropologist Michael Taussig, and we're very pleased to have Michael here tonight with us to provide introductions and to expand on his ideas around these films, particularly in relation to what he terms the mimetic faculty and the interweaving concepts of imitation and difference. So the format of this evening is that Michael will say a few introductory words before each screening, starting with Les Maîtres Fous. And then after the screenings, he will give a talk of around 30 minutes. And there's also an additional section of film thrown in, which I'm sure Mick will introduce, of the axe fight by Timothy Ash. And the total running time of all the films is around 1 hour. So Michael Taussig is a professor of anthropology at Columbia University in New York. His most recent book is The Corn Wolf, published this year, a collection of his writing that marries storytelling with theory and analysis with ethnography. His previous books include Beauty and the Beast, Walter Benjamin's Grave, Magic of the State, Mimesis and Alterity, and The Devil and Commodity Fetishism in South America, among many others. Before I hand over to Michael, I just wanted to say a few words of thanks to supporters of this exhibition and this program. So a thank you to the Friends of Artist Space who support all our programs, and specifically to the Union Gaucho Productions Exhibition Supporters Circle, which is Miguel Abreu, Bortolami Gallery, and Begum Yusur Dominique Levy Gallery. So thank you to them, and I'll hand over to Mick. Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay at the back? There's still a little bit of room here it sounds like you're going to stand for a long time. That was a great introduction, almost as good as my friend Stefan Pasha's about a year ago, who's sitting in the front row, and it was very good. I want to thank Nick and Karen for inviting me. I was going to say curating me. And I've decided to curate these films in a particular way. A very few words about Les Maîtres Fous, which I think are necessary, and then maybe a slight pause, and then we're going to go into The Laughing Alligator. But I want to precede The Laughing Alligator with about 3 minutes of film by Timothy Ash and Napoleon Chagnon called The Axe Fight, because there's no way you can, I think, get on board The Laughing Alligator if you don't see this preceding film, which in my opinion is a sort of ghost in the film, or a counterpoint to the film. So there'll be 3 films, 2 films that last about half an hour, and there'll be 3 minutes in between the 2. And then I'll talk at the end of all of that make some remarks. Now, what I wanted to wanted to say about Maître Fou is the film is made in filming in 1953. It's finished in 1955. The independence of Ghana, which is important to know, is 2 years later in 1957. Okay, next point. The film concerns migrants, working class migrants from Niger, a small republic to the north of Ghana, small country to the north of Ghana rather, which form the focus of the migrants form a focus of a cult, we'll call it the Hauka cult, H-U-K-A, it's spelled generally. Now this Hauka cult gets together every so often on the outskirts of Accra, and the members become possessed, and they become possessed by what? They become possessed by the spirits of dead French colonial officers, and sometimes their wives. There's a particular spirit, the Wicked Major, who's on record in Paul Stoller's pretty extensive ethnography and history of this movement. There's a particular spirit called the Wicked Major who's on record as having beaten up, slapped around, jailed Hauka people, hence the name the Wicked Major. There'll be other spirits. The fascinating thing for me and most of you will be, what does this imply for Europe looking at itself through possessed people? What sort of power is involved? How do you take this into account? I will show the film now, and we'll talk about it at length, some of the things that I find interesting, and then take questions after Laughing Alligator. So could we show the film now? Perhaps a trivial comment is that this film was received with a lot of anger as well as acclaim when it was shown in Paris in '55. Some anthropologists like Marcel Griol walked out saying it was a colonialist, exotic piece of work. Other people like Jean Genet were totally enthralled and went on to write a play called Les Noirs, The Blacks. So it had this very different sort of impact. I thought watching it, it might be helpful to think of you or me or us as involved in a ritual as well. Not just a normal film-going ritual, not the Hauka ritual per se, but trying to understand to some degree the passion and energy that's involved in spirit possession, which is, strangely enough, in the West, seems to be one of the very few populations in, shall we say, modern history, which does not participate in much possession, if at all. So the question is not how do people get possessed or why do they get possessed, but why don't we? Second thing is the eating of the dog. You probably distance yourself from that. But I'm sort of inviting you to examine your feelings about crossing that divide, and in that Dionysic spirit of pain and joy, as Nietzsche would put it, indulge in the breaking of a very severe taboo. Taboo not only to most people here or everybody here, but to Hauka as well. And of course, it's the breaking of the taboo that makes you more than, quote unquote, more than a man. So these are the three forces which I think propel the viewer into a ritualistic sort of trance when watching the movie. The first one is, what does it mean now, not 1955 Paris, but right now, to be involved in a film which displays such powerful colonial imagery. Now, that doesn't mean it's colonialist, right? And this is where people will argue and so forth. But one cannot deny the sort of very un-PC nature, if I can put it that way, of what is being shown. I remember once showing this in class, and the students are very cool. I showed it to a bunch of professors about my age 10 years ago, and I could see they were very disturbed. And they were polite, but I could see that they felt this was not really something that they wanted to watch, or if they wanted to watch, they didn't feel it was something that could be shown in public. So these are three, if you like, if I can make it less romantic, these are three challenges to a viewer. You can't view such material in a neutral form: killing and eating a dog, becoming possessed, and the confrontation or becoming face-to-face with this strong colonialist white-on-black imagery. I'll talk later about possession, bodily possession, and its relationship to making a film. I don't want to do that right now. I wanted to move on now to talk a little bit about a lesson, Juan Downey's film. I'm going to first show a few minutes, as I said, of Chagnon and Ash's film, which was made in late 60s. You should remember that Napoleon Chagnon, who was actually taught in my department for a year before he went on to bigger and better things in Michigan, wrote a book called Yanomamo, The Fierce People, published in 1968. And by now it's probably sold 4 million copies. This is including the resales, right? But it's probably up around 4 million. There's no book in anthropology which would come anywhere close to sales like that. That means it was used in colleges. It was a sort of training tool, combined with the film, of course, for countless numbers of young Americans. It's unsparing description of male aggression is explained by Chagnon in his writings as compelled or caused by men competing for women, and thus increasing their quote-unquote reproductive fitness. So he's a social Darwinist, writes as a social Darwinist, what was called social biology, which had, up till pretty recently, was a very popular form of explaining behavior, especially of so-called primitive people. The film I'm going to show you was the most popular film. There were 20 films made by Tim Ash of Harvard and Chagnon. The gist of the film is to promote or sustain that image of the Yanomamo as super macho and super fierce and so forth. I won't go too much into the stylistic differences. They should be pretty obvious. But the film, in a sense, is a Yanomamo film in the sense that Chagnon uses the word of the fierce people. It's a fierce film. It's a very male film. It's a very male voice. It's a very didactic film. And the idea is to show chaos, confusion, violence. And then the expert steps in and shows you how the violence can be explained in the first instance, by showing you a kinship diagram with the different actors' position in that diagram. So you move from a sort of a chaos to an anthropological expert explanation in terms of what is really magic, right? Showing you a kinship diagram. So I'm just going to show you the opening shot, three-quarters of a minute, and then I'm going to show you this sort of where everything is brought together and order is restored in the expert's mind. And then we'll move to the laughing alligator, and I think you'll get an understanding of some of the background, some of the ideology which the laughing alligator was made against. So let's show the Chagnon Ash piece first. What a genius film, huh? I thought I'd be fairly pedantic and talk about the Maitre Fou first and then Laughing Alligator, and bear with me. I had already mentioned some striking features to think of watching Les Maitre Fou. I forgot to mention, for those of you who don't know Rouch at all, that he's widely considered the father of ethnographic film. He was an engineer in the French army in West Africa during the Second World War, liked it a whole lot, and geared up as a filmmaker, and sort of never left. And he has an enormous army of friends in West Africa and made many films. This seems a very casual, easygoing way in which people he made films with like him, he likes them. And I sometimes get the feeling, say, compared with the Downey film, he sort of wings it. The Downey film, by contrast, is so not only so funny, but so incredibly clever and easy at the same time, but super, super smart the way it works. Rouch's film, by contrast, it's the matter, the information, the contents is what I'm looking for, are so striking, and he does a great job filming that. Juan Downey, Richard mentioned both of these, I think following Nick, both of these are documentaries which, in a way, document documentary. They contain a sort of auto-critique and so on. Well, that's ever so much more in the case of the Juan Downey film. It's as if that is the film, that is the matter of the film. That's why I called my review of it Looking and Laughing, or A Lesson in Looking and Laughing. One of the things that are so puzzling about the Chagnon films, Chagnon and Ash films, is Chagnon comes over as so unrepentantly had-ass, tough-minded, un-PC. The savage is not a noble savage. You know, whereas if you look at the Downey film, you can't help thinking a lot of the time that that's been simply flipped over. Instead of a fierce people, we've got the laughing people, right? And you can see that as partly as an antidote to the legend that was being formed with the Ash Chagnon perspective. But it's more than that. One of the things that's so interesting, thinking about mimesis, I'll go into more later, is how Chagnon is really a very a really tough guy, he's like the second of a huge Catholic family from Upper Michigan, and you get the feeling he's seen life in the raw. He knows all about, prides himself on his hunting skills and I guess fighting skills. And so it's like that thing, people look like the dog that they have, anthropologists become like the people they study, you know. And Judith Shapiro, who became president of Barnard, she worked with the Yanomamo, and he told her, no way you can go there, you know, you'll be raped, you'll be violated, etc. And I never spoke to her about this, but I think she had a great time without being raped or violated. It's as if Chagnon projects himself to some extent. But the harder point I want to make is that there's a way in which I think Chagnon has a point. because the anthropologists fall over themselves saying how wonderful primitive people, quote unquote, are, and innocent, and the noble savage thing, you know, is very, very strong. But the reality, of course, can't be that simple. But Chagnon is not a diplomat, and he shoots his mouth off, and he then goes an extra mile with his theories of violence as genetically determined and all this sort of stuff. But I do want to say it's a very complicated sort of situation. It's also very complicated because there's incredible warfare going on, not simply between the Yanomamo, but between the missionaries and the anthropologists, the missionaries and the other missionaries. And the worst warfare probably, and Chagnon is very outspoken on this, is the violence between anthropologists, accusing each other of you know, all sorts of stuff. So once you start to get into this swamp of Downey, Chagnon, Yanomamo, you know, it's unstoppable. There's plot behind plot, complexity behind complexity. So if we just withdraw a bit and put Chagnon on the side of the violent van and the Downey film on the side of the laughing people, you know, you very quickly have to move on from that sort of simplicity, which is dear to our hearts. And we're all, I think, in a sense, colonialist. We all inherit images and feelings about the noble savage and the violent savage and so forth. Perhaps this sort of film will help provide the magic to make that not only more complex, but more understandable. Now, on some points I wanted to make about the Rouch film. I wanted to go back a bit to the origin of the cult of the Hauka. I'm not an expert on this, and I doubt there are. But one thing that really struck me was the violence that's involved in the French and the British attitude towards the Hauka, which Rouch, in this charming way, just sort of flies over and glosses over, and it's all a bit of a joke, really, for him. The movement began amongst Songhai, S-O-N-G-H-A-Y people in Niger in 1925, and they would dance and become possessed by the spirits of colonial administrators. I want to make a parenthesis. There's a book by the German, very highly respected anthropologist, Fritz Kramer, in English called The Red Fez, and he claims that becoming possessed by the spirit of the other existed in many parts of Africa long before colonial endeavours. Well, that's saying a lot. The Portuguese are in West Africa in, what, 1420 or something, 1400 anyways. But you want to bear this in mind. It didn't grow out of nothing. There's sort of a tradition of getting power and value from outside the society, okay? And so that would happen presumably before the colonial powers invaded Africa, and maybe it picked up a great head of steam afterwards, but you get the point. They became possessed by spirits of the French major, who had first taken the offensive against them. So this cult is not just a cult. It's seen by the Brits and the French, and this is what's so interesting to me. The colonist gets into the magic too. The colonist cannot ignore it. There's something uncanny about what these people are doing, and it upsets me, it worries me. This is the sort of thing Fanon would say. And I think Fanon's very pertinent here, because the violence that he talked about that would take over the Algerian peasant and the Algerian lumpen proletariat in response to the French violence is in a way seen exactly in this Rouch movie. Rouch doesn't talk about that at all. You know, in a way, Rouch is above politics. The French major, the major, wicked major, we'll call him, who took offence against them, who imprisoned them, and the people who began the movement slapped them around and said there was no such thing as Hauka. Thus deified as the wicked major, his spirit has got on the very first floor of the Hauka pantheon as one of its most violent spirits. Thus possessed, the Songhai would mimic the white man, and sometimes their wives too, and acquire strange powers. Thus the movement spread an intolerable affront to French authority, and I'm quoting from Stoller, an intolerable affront to French authority. That doesn't come out in the movie. Okay? Thus they took the power of the man who shaped them, shook them around, and the French and the native chiefs, who were complicit with the French, discovered the presence of an open dissidence, I quote, an open dissidence, a society. Could you put that up a little bit, give me a bit more light? Yeah, that's in your face probably. An open dissidence, a society the members of which openly defied the social, political and religious order. I'm quoting from Stoller. It is here that we discover the most original aspect of the Hauke movement, their total refusal of the system put in place by the French. That's Stoller. One of the things that Stoller goes on to point to make is that the possessed, the spirit, the possessed person is seen with horror, but also in comedy. And how that exactly works, I can't remember, or he doesn't say. But you know, when Nietzsche talks about the Dionysus and so forth, and you read the Bacchae and so forth, you see that this mix of opposition, something can be funny, something can be terrible, terrifying, and that also full of a strange love that is of course desire. This ungainly mix, this unusual mix, which I think we all understand straight away, intuitively, has to be recognised in amongst these possessed people as well. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the mimetic in the Hauke, and much less so in the Laughing Alligator. And I wanted to refer to this essay written in 1933 by Walter Benjamin called On the Mimetic Faculty, which followed on the heels of something similar called The Doctrine of the Similar. And in the opening, it's a 3-page essay, 3.25-page essay, and in the opening paragraph, Benjamin states very flat, very strongly, something that he's been working on, been thinking about probably since he was a small kid, and in more theoretical terms since, I guess, the early 20s. He writes this in 33 on the island of Ibiza. Nature creates similarities. One need only think of mimicry. The highest capacity for producing similarities, however, is man's. His gift of seeing resemblances, this is what fascinated Benjamin, seeing resemblances, you know, looking at a stained wall and seeing faces and so forth. He claims that this is a way of seeing the world, a capacity for relating to reality, which we moderns have lost, right? So we go from seeing resemblances to a pointed, stronger form, which is we're going to call mimesis, which is the love, the want, the desire, even the capacity to become other. And I quote now, his gift, person's gift of seeing resemblances is nothing other, now this is a very leading statement, is nothing other than a rudiment of the powerful comparison in former times. You couldn't write sentences like that now, I don't think. To become and behave like something else. So seeing similarities involves an arc in which the viewer becomes that which is being seen, presenced, we could say, so as we can include seeing and touching, hearing and touching. Perhaps there is none of his higher functions, man's functions, in which the mimetic faculty does not play a decisive role. This is hugely fighting words, because here's a man who was soaked in the study of language, and every language theorist from Plato on says the mimetic does not play a role in the relationship between signifier and signified. And Benjamin won't have that, okay? He comes out with his ammunition on the mimetic faculty. Now, the mimetic faculty can be an image-based activity in which a photograph, a painting, is a resemblance of what it's a copy of, or it can involve some of the physical features, such as part of the body which you wish to influence. If it's a human being, might be their hair, might be their semen, might be their underclothing, and so forth. And the two together, the magic of likeness, or the mimesis of likeness, and secondly the mimesis of contagion or contact or body, often go together in magical amulets. So when I say mimesis, I'm talking about a visual image or something that's like something. Take the photograph, sticking a pin in the face of a person in order to harm them, or the other type of mimesis, which involves getting something of the body or something that's close and intimate to that other person and then putting it into ritual in order to influence. Now, this is seen as, by Horkheimer and Adorno in their Dialectic of Enlightenment, as something which has been for a long time forbidden in the West or downplayed in the West. It might not be openly prohibited. It might just require less and less steam power or interest or consciousness, okay? Now I want to switch back to the possessed situation of the Hauker, of the Maitre Fou. One of the things that fascinates me in this film is, and it bowls me over, right, as it must you, is not only this interest in getting power by mimicking the European, becoming more than a man, and doubling on that, if you like, by committing the tabooed act of eating the dog while possessed. It's like a double whammy, right? So you're possessing the white man and you're also doing the worst thing you can possibly do, eat the dog. Irresistible power flows from that, right? My interest was highly focused upon that moment when the egg is cracked on the head of the governor, and then the film editor gets out his or her scissors and immediately montages the Governor General of Ghana, the Queen's representative, stepping out of his car with the yellow and white ostrich plumes. And I felt, when I have sometimes shown that film, and certainly the first couple of times I showed the film, I felt the audience when I was in performance studies, the audience of graduate students, there was a sort of, not that loud perhaps. And that's what I call mimetic excess. And this is what I'm getting at. It's suddenly like mimesis crawls out of the screen and envelops you. It's mimesis for the love of it. It's mimesis for the heck of it. It's irresistible. This is not to become a more sane person, those lame things that Rouch says at the end of the movie. Well, look, man, this is a way they can go away for the weekend and come back after being possessed and be a good worker, And who's to say that they haven't got a better system than we have? I mean, I think that's such junk. Let me put it a little bit differently. The European can't get possessed, hasn't got a tradition of being possessed. You might disagree with me, or the rave, or, you might say there's something equivalent in the West, but it's nothing like what you saw in the movie, okay? Benjamin, in his mimetic faculty question, says, little kids, they love miming. They play at all sorts of things. Doctors, nurses, mechanics, the windmill. They open a grocery store, all that sort of stuff. In the ancient world of Greece and Rome, a lot of mimicry, a lot of doctrine of the similar, reading the future through the intestines of the guinea pig. You go from the intestines to the future. You go from the intestines to when the stars, the constellation they were in when the baby was born. Those sort of resemblances, okay? But it seems to be all over. It's all disappearing, And he says, has it disappeared? Or will it surface again? Or has it surfaced in other ways? And he says, yeah, it has surfaced. It has always been present in language. And as I said, that's the hardest thing. That's a really hard philosophical argument. But he had it all there down in Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. The movies pick up on the mimetic faculty. He said it 1 million times. He bored the hell out of you. The images bore into you, or you disappear in the screen. That's one of his favorite tropes, you know. So the mimetic faculty was really alive and well with the movies and the movie maker. So what do we find in Accra in 1953? We find these people who have not lost the capacity to be possessed. And we find the man who can't get possessed himself has got this mimetically capacious machine, i.e. the movie camera. And they come together, boom. The semi-naked body being possessed, and the European with the mimetic machine. And they come together right at the point of decolonization, which happens 2 years later. The British banned the film and said it was an insult to the Queen, and they picked out, according to Rouch, they picked out exactly that scene with the egg on top of the Governor General. That was the scene that they said, this is the point of disrespect of regal authority. So this is my favorite thing, I guess, to say. It makes my head move in high velocity, that moment of what I call mimetic excess. I wanted to now move over to Downey. I wanted to say, first of all, as I remember, the film is made in the mid-70s. It's made by Juan Downey, his wife, Mary-Lise, and his stepdaughter, Titi, T-I-T-I, who does a lot of the voiceover right at the beginning. And I hope I'm not like being overly boring and professorial if I say it's so amazing to compare the faltering voice, high voice of this teenage girl at the beginning saying, you know, compared with the Chagnon voiceover that you saw at the beginning of the act side. I mean, it's unfair to point it out. It is such a gross difference. But it's one most of us, people my age, we lived with the voiceover of the Chagnon people. I think pretty sure that's Chagnon's voice, telling you what to think, telling you what's going on. First off, they draw a map. You can't have a film like that without a map. That's Anglo, I grew up in Australia, you know, that's Anglo-realism, documentary. But here in the Downey film, we're into another world straight away. Now, they spent 7 months in this one village. That is a long time, I think, to live in such circumstances. Secondly, a revolution was afoot. The revolution was the portable video camera. Nam June Paik and all his cronies, of whom Downey was one, had this new apparatus. They were going to make movies that could compete with TV. And you could get instant feedback and see what was on the screen. So there's a mimetic element in the Downey film too, where he shows people what's being filmed. And he ends his film on that point with the deaf-mute, who all were meaningless or non-words croaks and cries. And my understanding of that croaks and cries, you might think I'm a bit far-fetched, is that you'll never understand. As opposed to the kinship diagram, you can find out a lot of stuff, you can film a lot of stuff, but ultimately it's all a big mystery and a puzzle, and the two of you get on okay, you know, most of the time, but there's also a huge gap there in understanding, and that's my understanding of the deaf-mute at the end. From A Guide to the Fierce People by Chagnon, quote, "The Yanomama prize ferocity among men. Young boys are taught to be fierce and are rewarded when they strike out at others, even adults," end of quote. Chagnon describes several attempts on his life. including axe attacks when he was asleep, and Indians shooting an effigy of him shot with arrows for fear he was using bad magic. So at the beginning, when he's saying the anthropologist had warned me, you know, it seems to me such an obvious reference. And when he's got this standoff with his camera and their bow and arrows, I couldn't help but thinking of Chagnon sort of getting the reader to quake in fear that our hero Napoleon, the Indians had made an effigy of him and shot it full of arrows because he was suspected of having bad magic, which is part of the white man's deal. You know, the Indians have got magic, but we have magic too, according to the Indians. We're pretty good. You see what I mean? On the one hand, you put it down, irrationality and stuff like that, but it's sort of nice if people think you've got magic. Later, the fierceness toned down a little, but also got narrower with his, what I call genetic racism using sociobiology, which was a big player in this country in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Chagnon worked with James Neal, a geneticist at the University of Michigan from the late 60s, collecting blood samples from some 60 villages. So he was moving fast, and he visited too many places in his Odin mission, okay, to get blood, because Neal wanted blood from people who had not been exposed to any atomic radiation after his studies in Japan, and he wanted to get blood which was, in that sense, pure. A measles epidemic occurred in 1968, and in the year 2000, Patrick Tierney, a sensationalist journalist, produced a book, Darkness Falls on El Dorado, in which he accused Chagnon and Neal of intentionally inflicting measles as part of their studies. And this was complete bullshit, but Chagnon was such a great target, and so many anthropologists hated him because he was so, you know, I've described him. Everyone was ready to believe it, and the whole thing was a hideous thing. Margaret Mead sort of tried to put the fires out, said this is nothing but book burning, referring to the Nazis and so forth. And it's so again, the complexity of the situation. The Chagnon approach strikes me as awful, but what these other people did to him is awful too. So a real mess. And so what we're seeing in Downey's film, I understand as a sort of a welcome relief from all that missionary hate, anthropologists, hate state representatives, hate. In 2012, Chagnon was elected to the National Science Foundation. Yes, and Marshall Salins resigned in protest. Downey, according to what I read, was involved in filming what I call, or he called, an American Odyssey, which would be film work from North America, if not Canada, certainly the USA, down through Guatemala, into Chile. I remember a lot of silent, black and white, stark, quiet movies. And then he wanted to get involved with the lowland forest people. I always think of this film, and I use this film for teaching writing. Not that you can teach writing. This film struck me as the closest I'd ever get to it. I talk about it as a film which to me brings out the filmic nature of film, and I'm sure people who study film, that's no big discovery. It's not so much the discovery, it's the way it's done, the impact it has on you to watch this. I combine that with, I say, many stories are told simultaneously, which is not so easy to do when you're writing. But if you're a very talented filmmaker, you can do it. I think of the beginning of his Downey saying, "I want to be eaten by cannibals," and he puts himself in the TV box. And there's this amazing sequence of, like, in 30 seconds, so many different things. And there's some sort of Spanish Harlem voices, "Let me out of here, let me out of here." and he's looking really intense, and suddenly you see these legs going up and down, and then you see film shots through a red feather by the chin. It's also beautiful. It's not, I was going to say bewildering, that's wrong. It's not bewildering at all. It's smooth, right? It's got this ripple action going through it. There's friction there, but it's basically smooth. So much emphasis on face and body, close-up, right? Even to use these terms is bold and insensitive. I mean, you say, well, there's a lot of face, a lot of body. I mean, you feel it when you see the movie, right? Nowhere more so than when the young man is attaching the blue feather to the arrow and slowly winding the cotton around it, sitting down there, the body as a vice, the axilla, the armpit as a vice, and the arrow becomes part of the body. The blue becomes black, the black becomes blue as it's slowly twirled. It's an amazing sequence. Hammocks sway, bodies move. The canoe slides into and across shadows, nearly always in parts that suggest new holes, always in tight close-ups of the body accompanied by laughter. It is uncanny, bodies so close up you can touch them, you think, and the water ripples along with the laughter rippling. Are they laughing at us? Are they laughing at being filmed? We all remember ourselves laughing like that too, embarrassed by the camera. We see parts instead of holes, reality pivots sideways, yet the path remains linear. Hallucinogenized men crawl on the beaten earth, talking to spirits and each other like perambulating crabs. Oh, now they are upside down, hanging from Mother Earth. How can that be? Oh, it must be the film. That's it, the film. Things are taken out of context and put into others. A flower is suddenly interspersed in a shaman's mad dance. A pair of feet drum up and down hard on the dirt after JD's face is displayed trapped in a TV monitor screaming, "Let me out of here." I had a little note to myself about wit constituting reality. This may be the formula of the film. The canoe slides across and into shadows. The screen fills with the string necklace on the chest of the young man seated in the stern, paddling. But he is sideways. Does that sentence make sense? JD's teenage daughter-in-law, Titi, is talking off-screen, in a high-pitched adolescent voice, giving us, in a nicely casual, unhurried way, the lowdown on the Yanomami. What daily life is like, how the young men appear to her, how you can't talk to or even look at your mother-in-law, and so on. There is a sense of love and curiosity in her pauses as she moves from idea to idea, as does the camera. It is busy, relaxed but busy. The color palette changes. The canoe keeps moving into a strange realm of sliding surfaces. Now the young man is upright, vertical, is back to vertical, and gravity has been restored. Now the screen fills with the design painted in dark brown on the light brown of his cheek. Now we see an exquisitely carved orange-brown paddle dipping and lifting, dipping and lifting. Now the paddle is being used in a deft motion to bail the water out of the canoe bottom. Now the paddler is bailing with his hands. Meanwhile, the sound of the bailing fills our ears, forming a background to Titi's unscripted description of the Yanomami life. It is a sound somewhere between the sonority of a bell and the slurping of a hungry man eating. Now she is talking about how much she liked her 7 months there and would like to go, not come, like to go back and visit. The colours and intensity of light across the shadows on the river keep subtly changing. Here, storytelling is conducted in many modes simultaneously. The art lies in the combinations, plural, set up at any one instant between speech, ambient sound, and the shifting imagery. All film does this, you say, but not like Downey filming with the Yanomamo, giving us a lesson in laughter and looking. I think I'll finish there, and I think some of you would like to ask questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Mick, hello. Thank you very, very much. It was extraordinary to see Le Maître Fou 50 years later. I saw it in '65 in Paris, and it's incredible, 50 years later. How do you look at this film, at this same film?
And extraordinarily beautiful
It's
prints.
quite different, actually.
Yeah.
It's quite different.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could say a few words about what happened to the Hauka cult after independence, over the last 50 years.
I don't know. Rouch says there were no Hauka after independence, and there was no Nkrumah Hauka. And that's what I remember. He leaves it at that. I bet it didn't go away. Yeah.
Hi, Mick. So two things. I remember actually I saw Jean Rouch showing this film in the 90s together with another movie, which was about it was filmed in Paris about the labor, kind of beauty of labor. I don't remember the title of it, but he showed these two films together. And I have notes somewhere what he said about them. I'm interested in this moment in the Rouch film where they actually, it's the introduction when, before the possession rituals happen, when there is this focus on the men meeting many times in the evenings together and planning it in some kind of way and going off further, implying that there is a sense of being outside and inside of the ritual space.
Oh, yeah.
And in a way, somehow, I know we don't have rituals like that, but there is also, I have been in situations in Western society when there's a certain group agreement about understanding and trust of a certain situation, that things come up in the social behavior that are very similar to what you might observe as a kind of observer. So I just wondered whether there are certain parallels of the context of the requirements for the ritual to happen that are within that planning zone and within that understanding of what is in and out. There are some people that are expelled and some people that belong, and obviously all participants understand their roles. So this moment of being possessed is a fraction of a bigger structure. So in that space, I can understand, there are some parallels in our Western world that play on that difference and allow these things to coexist somehow, maybe not to that extreme.
Sure. This night is turning into living history. 1965, 1990. All ritual and theatre and acting is based on inside and outside, and the action takes place in the middle, in between, right? So you could have it geographically or spatially marked out, the center and the periphery, the inside and the outside. In relationship to the Hauka, specifically, I was thinking, what does it mean for a person of color to imitate a person not of non-color? What does it mean when the possession involves such unusual physical characteristics as rolling the eyes, as producing enormous amounts of sputum, of walking in a catatonic sort of way with maybe 50%, 90% of your consciousness in another place, right? My understanding of the possession that I know in Venezuela is that when one is possessed, one is in some sense conscious of oneself, sees oneself from the outside, and so on and so forth. So these sort of in-between states, I think encompasses what you're talking about, whether it's of consciousness, but in particular in reference to this film, the politics of it, the aesthetics of it, the physiology of it. If a person of color, his eyes are moving like that, and the camera's working really hard to get those eyes, and that catatonic gait, and the game playing, you know, between the general and the wicked major, and so on, something that is also involved in your question. Are they actually imitating, or how well are they imitating, or in what way are they imitating the colonial master? Because it's obviously an imperfect imitation that can involve, or does involve, spoofing and poking fun at that which you are imitating, and in some sense, as I see it, taking power from. And so that's this question of a differentiation between inside and outside, to me involves this, there are different ways you could phrase it, but this flitting between the imitation and the debunking of that which you're imitating. At least that's how I see it. Other people might say, you have to imitate, you become the white person, you become the wicked major, and thereby you take the power. There's another element in this. When you look at a film like this, how shall I put it? It adds another layer. It's creating its own reality. Right? So we have to include that as well. So it's not just an in-between state between center and periphery, inside and outside. It's a movement back and forth, and extraordinary work, artistic work is being done in gravitating, you know, put the emphasis on the action that's involved. So we'd all do that, yes, Elke, yeah. You especially.
You did a really excellent job, I think, sort of looking at the sort of mimetic aspects within the film, and then how that sort of translates into the magic of film itself. But I'm interested also in sort of the other, like Fraser's other law of magic, if we're gonna go there, of contagion. Which I think, like, we see like moments within each film of, you know, consumption, like of the dog, or of the desire to be eaten or to eat the dead. So there are sort of moments internal to the film of, or to these two films, of contagion and this magical operation of contagion. But I'm curious how you see film itself as a medium functioning not just mimetically, but sort of having this sort of aspect of contagion as well.
I can't answer it. I mean, you did an excellent job. I imagine film buffs would have a field day answering your question. They could find example after example. My friend Nancy Goldring is in the here, and she always raps me over the knuckles because I'm overly enthusiastic about Benjamin's ideas of the body of the viewer goes into the screen, or the images on the screen go into the body of the viewer. And the small child loves colored pictures, says Benjamin, because the color is like an invitation to come into the story, and so on. So there's certainly bodily movement, but this is one eccentric, crazy thinker. And she says, oh, there's, you know, it's interesting, but, you know, it's not all that's going on. I'm looking at my notes on the mimetic in Downey. It's nothing like the Maitre Feu, at least on my analysis. It's not nearly as marked, not nearly as visible. The other film that I worked on a bit was Trobriand Cricket. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's a pretty amazing film, made about the time of decolonization in the 50s in the islands just east of New Guinea, in which there's extraordinary mimicry and dance, and also this mimetic magic. this mimetic excess that I talk about. It's hard, your question, because, I mean, we're looking at a film, we're looking at a photograph, and it's hard to think how a physical object or a physical something could be transmitted with the to the viewer, or the viewer to the screen. You know, my reading and understanding of certain types of sorcery and witchcraft involve a mysterious movement of thought that goes, let's say, through the air, acts invisibly on the body of the person who, let's call the person the victim, where it will form a physical object which is extracted by a shaman, maybe a splinter or an octopus, a little mouse, all sorts of strange stuff, right? So it's like it starts off as, let's say, something, visual image, meaning basically a thought, maybe attached to a song. I'm thinking of the Putumayo area of the Upper Amazon in Colombia. I'm thinking of witchcraft that I've read about in Nigeria, as well, in the books by the Bohannans. There's a movement here between an idea invisibly moving to form a physical object in the body of the victim, which is taken out by the healer. The Bohannans describe the accumulation of fat around the heart of the sorcerer, which you can find on post-mortem. As Andy described by Evans Pritchard in the 30s, there's witchcraft substance in the body of the sorcerer. I say sorcerer, these terms we can talk about later. And the relatives can get so upset that one of their kin has been accused of being a sorcerer, that when that person dies, they'll insist on a post-mortem to show that the substance is not there. But of course, the substance can be the appendix, it can be in the liver, it can be in the bile, whatever, and so forth. So that's another area, of course, very exotic and rarefied and strange. And anthropologists don't talk about these things anymore, where something quasi-visual, I imagine, imagining this is going to happen, and it results in a physical object. But your question's great, and you probably have got some answers. There's probably something really obvious that I overlooked.
Thanks for your... Sorry, is it on?
Tough to start a question like that.
I'm interested in the relationship between art and anthropology or ethnography, and the role of film in both, because film, in what we've just seen, isn't just recording mimesis coming into being, but it itself also a mimetic faculty. And I remember you did some work on Arnoud Mick's films, his art pieces.
Oh yeah, time ago.
Long time ago, and I was just wondering whether
Dutch?
you care to, comment on these works and maybe the relationship, the difference, or the parallels between these obviously artistic forms of mimesis and these ethnographic films.
Why don't you describe to people a little bit of the work and jog my memory at the same time?
Yeah, so Arnoud Mick does staged videos, staged films where he puts actors in a given setting, but there's no script or a very loose script. And he just lets kind of, he lets the events just unfold in front of his camera, and thus kind of tries to expose rituals that we incorporate without knowing it. Or
Yeah, very good.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember one is a political gathering. Another one is people being taken into some sort of really scary reception center in Yugoslavia, or what is about to become ex-Yugoslavia, let's say Serbia, and one group of people act the victims, and one group of people act the soldiers and so forth. And it goes on for a long time, right? Maybe an hour, 2 hours, something like that. So the question would be, what would the use of thinking about mimesis add to one's everyday understanding?
Yeah, and also the role what that film plays in this, in both the artistic sense, because Arnoud Mick's work is fiction, but this is, you know, documentary. So I'm just wondering whether you care to comment on the medium.
No. See, as was sort of implied in your question, I mean, what interests me in the mimesis is the magical power of the copy, which remains pretty much unacknowledged. And in these two films, or at least in the Maître Fou, it is super acknowledged. Hits you over the head, has to. Not only because people are imitating the colonist, but because of the way they're doing it, their possession and so forth. So the exoticism practically drowns you out, you know. But in the case of Arnoud Mick's, these are that I don't. In a sense, the quote-unquote magic of film is operating all the time, right? But it's not of the same caliber or intensity for me. That's all I can say, and I'm sorry. I wanted to. I think there's another question right here. Yeah.
I saw Le Maître Fou in the early '80s, and read it completely differently than you did. I read that Rouch's refusal or abstinence from making political comments opened the space for me to watch the caricature of the colonial masters, you know, with a tremendous range of response to it, you know, that if he had discoursed on the politics of all that, that experience wouldn't be available to me. My horror, my pleasure, my trying it on, imagining, participating in some trance at that extreme version. So I was grateful, and I read it very politically, and a very political choice to not extemporize on, you know, the results of colonialism in Accra, for instance.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. I can see why one would do that. Yeah. There's a strange politics in that I didn't mention. I think in the Downey film, which is a bit far-fetched. You know, there's this anthropologist that the young people like a lot, and the old people like Peter Wilson, Pierre Clastre, who have died like all these French intellectuals in a car accident. And he wrote a book called In English Society Against the State, and a famous ethnography called The Chronicle of the Guayaquil, and so forth. And Clastre hung out with Jacques Lizotte, who was another enemy of Chagnon, only to fall foul of anthropological invidia when he was accused of having a harem of young Yanomamo boys, and it just goes on. Anyway, Clastre moves from that Yanomamo situation to Paraguay, and he develops this thesis of, you know, I was a communist, sort of, and then I became a Levi-Straussian, and I'm an anarchist Levi-Straussian, and I watered down Levi-Strauss a bit. You know, I don't hit you over the head with all those structures and so forth. And believe me, the Indians of the Amazon rainforest are like born anarchists, and they have built into their society, not just in their heads, this incredible refusal to let power congeal. So the minute a chief develops, they move upstream. But it's something about everything, the way you laugh, the way you walk, the way you bury your dead or eat your dead, to him that is diffuses power. I always get this mixed up. Centrifugal, not centripetal. Well, that's his take on it. I was thinking a lot about that in relation to the film. The film seems to me, with the laughter and I'll call it anarchic quality of the film form, to in a way parallel, long before Klaus wrote his book, this notion of decoagulating power. The slightest trace of power, you bring in your laughter acid, you know, your new type of formalism. And in the Shagnon Ash film, the attempt is completely different. It wants to, in my opinion, create a power of the expert, let alone our general understanding in the West that hierarchies are inevitable. It's another. You brought up the thing of politics, and I was thinking of it in relationship to class. So maybe we leave it at there, huh? What do you say? Been a long night, a lot of people sitting on the ground. So what do you say, Richard? You're the boss.
I think that's a good moment, yes.
Yeah, but I just want to say one thing. I felt I was very impolite when I said that was a great introduction, and I tried to make a joke, but it fell flat. And I cursed myself the whole evening, because it was a beautiful introduction. It's just that he's sitting here. I haven't seen him in years, and he really worked hard on a beautiful introduction. So
I think Stefan should redo the introduction now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mick. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.